All right, so it's 12:05 and I think we can get started now. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Grundfest Memorial Lecture this month. So before we get started with our speaker, I'll just give a quick brief intro and sort of set up the term. So as usual, we start at 12:05 as we are now, and the talk will go on till about 12:45, 12:50, after which we'll take audience questions. If you'd like to follow the lecture series and get updates on upcoming lectures, please do follow our lecture series webpage as well as our Twitter for updates on the same. The lecture series is called the Grundfest Memorial Lecture, and it's named after Professor Warren Grundfest at UCLA, who was an SPI fellow in biophotonics and a great advocate of junior scholars, which aligns with the goals of this lecture series in order to provide a platform to junior scholars and early stage faculty to portray their amazing work. I would also like to thank my co-organizers, Professor Achyuta Kadambi at UCLA and Professor Katie Bowman at Caltech, who have put in great efforts to organize this lecture series and get it to the way it is right now. So thanks a lot to them. Sorry, my computer is a bit laggy today. Yeah, and we would also like to thank our sponsor, Akasha Imaging, who have been very gracious and have sponsored an inverse honorarium for as an incentive for non-permanent speakers, such as PhDs and postdocs. With all that being said, it's my great honor to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Florian Willomitzer, who's a research assistant professor at Northwestern University. Professor Willomitzer will talk to us today about how we can use physical limits for computational imaging devices to better guide our design and development of the devices of tomorrow. So with that being said, I'll hand over the mic to Professor Willomitzer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess I share my screen now. So we have to play the same thing again. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
And now you can see the full screen PowerPoint?
Yep.
Can you see the cursor now? No, right?
No.
Here's it. Okay. Now you see the cursor. Okay. Yeah. Great. And I also post something in the chat right now. I will explain what this is later to everyone. Okay, good. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. And yeah, I have to say good afternoon, everybody, right, in Pacific time. Before I actually start, I would like to thank the organizers again here for the very kind invitation. I'm actually extremely excited about my virtual visit here today. And I'm particularly looking forward to the discussions in the student meetings in the afternoon. So I'm really looking forward to that. Also, this is the reason why I posted the link, is a quick technical comment. So I will show in this presentation a bunch of videos. And from my previous experience, I can actually tell that Zoom is like heavily restricting the bandwidth of these videos, and the videos might become a little bit choppy over Zoom. And this is the reason why I posted this link. So, and with this link, you can actually watch all the videos again in high quality if you want. Okay, so let's start now. Again, hello, my name is Florian Willomitzer. I'm a research assistant professor, and I'm leading the Computational 3D Imaging and Measurement Lab at Northwestern University. And today I'm going to talk about how to utilize fundamental physical and information theoretical limits to build better computational 3D imaging systems. And I will actually show you the virtue of this at the example of our recent research projects. But before we start, today I actually want to introduce our team, because research is always a group effort, right? So this here is our current team at Northwestern, and I hope you can see my cursor now, yeah? And at Northwestern, I'm actually working pretty close together with these 4 people here that you see on the top. And together we form a multidisciplinary team of faculty, which is advising a large cohort of students. So not all students are shown on this slide here. So here you just see the students which are directly involved in my current research projects and which are advised and co-advised by myself. And on the bottom, you see a list of our external university and industry collaborators, which I want to give credit to as well, of course. And this slide here, also pretty crowded, unfortunately, shows an overview of our current research projects. And even if this is a little bit crowded, you can hopefully see that the broader field of research here is computational imaging, optical 3D metrology, vision, technical optics, and 3D display applications. And I should also say that the principles and devices which are developed here, they can be used in a multitude of fields, which includes medical imaging, industrial inspection, robotics, automotive, forensics, cultural heritage application you see here, and AR, VR applications as well. And although these projects that you see here span a pretty wide range between applied research and development and basic research, there is an overarching theme which basically draws like a red line through all of my projects. And this is this thinking in fundamental limits, or the question, where are the limits? And this is something that was introduced to me by my PhD advisor, Gerd Häusler, very early on, and that I have basically continued now throughout my entire career. And special interest here is given to the physical limits and the information limits. And you might ask now, why is this actually important? Naja, this is important because the knowledge about limits prevents us from trying to make an unnecessary technical effort to build an impossible machine. And I have an extreme example for you. So think about the CERN particle accelerator. So this is an incredibly complex machine. Yeah? And you do not want to invest money and effort in such a machine if you know that what you're trying to show with this machine at the end is physically not possible. And in turn, this also means that if you know already that your device is already operating at the physical limit, then you can avoid unnecessary investments in better hardware, like for example, in a camera with higher pixel resolution or something like that. What does this actually mean now? I mean, does this mean you just optimize your device now, make it better and better and better until you hit a roadblock at a certain point and then you are done because you reached the limit? Yeah, not necessarily. Because, and this is also very important, limits often come in the shape of uncertainty products. Like for example, this famous Heisenberg uncertainty principle here. And such products make it actually possible to bargain with nature for a better measurement of one quantity by trading off the precision of another quantity. And this already forms the basis for the physical optimization of your device. So why are limits actually so important in imaging? And I also prepared a short warm-up example here from classical imaging. So let's say your friend is a photographer and he approaches you as an imaging scientist because he is somehow unsatisfied with the resolution of his photos. So he basically says that fine details of objects cannot be resolved in his photos. So he approaches you because he's thinking of buying the latest DSLR body with, I don't know, like 10 megapixel resolution or whatever. And he asks you as imaging scientist, is this a good idea? And the answer is, you don't know. You don't know before you had a closer look at the system. And the system in this case is simplified as a lens and a CCD or CMOS chip here. And let's say after closer observation, you see that the lens blur is actually so strong that the blurring spot of a single object point is already spread over multiple pixels. Yeah. So in this case, the answer is it would not make sense to buy a chip with higher resolution because the structures that are smaller than the blurring spot, they cannot be resolved anyway. So what we have to do here is we have to swap the objective. Yeah. And the way how an imaging scientist thinks about this problem is in terms of the so-called space bandwidth product. And the space bandwidth product here shown for the x direction is basically defined by the image dimension W divided by the smallest resolvable distance in the image. And this basically gives you the number of independently resolvable points in your image, or in other words, the degrees of freedom n. And in our example here, n is actually not the number of pixels. N is actually smaller. Yeah. And what I just told you is already the basic recipe how to optimize optical systems. So what you do is you identify the bottleneck of the information that flows through the system. And then you look how far you can improve this component without hitting any physical limit. So this example that I just showed you was from classical imaging. Some of you might be puzzled now what computational imaging actually is. And I have to say there are many definitions about that. And each of you working in computational imaging might have a slightly different one. Also depends a little bit if you work more on software or on hardware. So for the things that I'm doing, I like the following definition. And the definition is that computational imaging takes the classical imaging pipeline of a conventional camera and adds two very important components. And this is encoding, which can be done by the illumination or an optical mask, and decoding, which can be done or which is done with an algorithm. Yeah, and the information, and what is decoded here, that is the information that reaches the sensor to evaluate the final result. And whoever in the audience is actually a little bit familiar with information theory sees a striking resemblance to Shannon's transmission model for communication systems. So what this model does is it basically describes how source information is encoded so that it can pass the noise-affected communication channel without too many losses. And then it's decoded on the other side where the information should be delivered. And what is so striking now is that we can describe a computational camera as communication channel as well. So for example, if our computational imager would be a 3D camera, then the object surface information is encoded, and then it's transferred through optics and electronics, and later it's decoded with an algorithm that finally calculates the 3D image. And it's also well known that the most crucial component in such an information channel is actually the encoder. And the encoder, this is the role of the illumination. So the illumination serves as source encoder for the information. And this allows you to see something with your computational imager that you would not see otherwise. And this can be actually very, very powerful. And the most impressive example for me is always bright field, dark field phase contrast, which some of you might know originally comes from microscopy. Yeah? But similar techniques are also used in X-ray or CT imaging nowadays. So I don't know, maybe some of you can see this, maybe some of you not. So what you should see here, these are some cells. Yeah, this is an image of cells. You see the contrast is actually very bad. Yeah, and the magic of illumination encoding is now that if you observe the same object with the same camera and just slightly change the illumination encoder, then you can actually go from this image to this image. Wow. So what do we learn from that? We learn that choosing your illumination modality wisely, this can obviously lead to very powerful improvements. And these improvements will be also important for the further processing of your image and for the decoding. Yeah? And this insight actually plays a very important part in my research as well. So for today, I plan to talk about two subsets of my research projects. And these subsets are our triangulation measurement principles, which are working closely at the physical and information theoretical limits. And after that, I will talk about our synthetic wavelength imaging systems that recently received a lot of media attention, mainly because we can do something which is very fancy. And this is imaging objects around corners or through scattering media with a sub-millimeter precision. Yeah, and we will start with the triangulation-based principles. And one of them, the single-shot 3D movie camera, which I will focus on now, is indeed working at the limits of physics and information theory. And this is because the sensor provides a dense and precise point cloud that can also display high frequencies in each single camera frame. And to understand why this is actually so special, we first have to take a look at the current state of the art. And if we do that, we see that all state-of-the-art 3D sensing principles have at least one severe weak spot. So time-of-flight cameras have a typical depth precision in the centimeter range. And this is much too unprecise for many applications that we want to do. And for the triangulation methods, which are also sometimes called structured light methods, which I will focus on for this part now, we have here methods that rely on a temporal sequence of exposures, where the object has to remain perfectly still during the whole acquisition sequence. So those methods are not motion robust. And there is another class of triangulation sensors, which basically uses all kinds of spatially coded patterns. Like some of you might know that a similar method is used in the Apple Face ID sensor, for example. And the drawback here is that you need spatial bandwidth to read this code somehow. And this introduces you an inherent low pass filter on the data. And this makes it impossible to measure fine structures of the object or high object frequencies. So one principle that does not have these problems is multi-line triangulation. And multi-line triangulation works by projecting a narrow line pattern onto the object and observe it with a camera under triangulation angle. And then from the deformation of each line in the camera image, you can calculate a nearly perfect 3D profile. So this principle is single shot and it preserves high spatial resolution, but there's always a but, only along the lines. And between the lines, there's actually much space. And this makes a dense surface acquisition impossible. So obviously there's no free lunch here, right? But this problem actually seems quite easy to overcome, right? I mean, just project more lines, But the thing is, if we look more close at existing multi-line triangulation approaches, we see that these approaches are not able to project 10 or maybe in the best case 20 lines if no codification is applied. And it actually turns out that this problem is not just a technical problem. This problem has a fundamental character. Namely, the more lines we project, the harder it is actually for us to distinguish between the lines and to find out their right number or the right index is sometimes called. And this is especially true if the object contains these high surface frequencies, like these jumps that you see here. And if we draw that on a piece of paper, we see actually that the line density is limited by two parameters, which is the unique measurement range and the triangulation angle, which basically defines the precision of our method. And what we want now is we ideally want to have large values for line density, triangulation angle, and unique measurement range. But we can already see here that this is not possible because what we have here is an uncertainty relation. And what happens if we ignore this relation now and project too many lines on purpose, we see on this slide. So what happens is that the unique measurement range shrinks and we get these typical indexing ambiguities here that can be seen as jumps in the data. So this ambiguity problem actually bothered us for a very long time. And if we revisit now our uncertainty relation here, we see again exactly what I just said. So we see that for a fixed line density, we ideally want both of these yellow quantities as high as possible, to get correct indexing and high precision. And the question is now, how can we get that? And the answer, I directly give you the answer. The answer in this case is adding additional information by angular multiplexing, or in other terms, additional angular information which is captured by a second camera. So what we do is we add an additional camera in the system, and then we combine both cameras in a way so that one camera encloses a very small triangulation angle with the projection to generate a large measurement volume. And the other one encloses a large triangulation angle to generate high precision. And then the information of both cameras is then combined with an algorithm that we called the index back projection algorithm. And unfortunately, I have to skip this here in the interest of time, and I directly jump to the captured 3D model, but I'm actually happy to discuss this later during the questions. So this is the measured 3D model. In this case, the 3D model of a human face, my face, if you see that. And you can see that this model can be freely turned, and basically watched from every perspective, from different perspectives, basically like a hologram. And since this is now really acquired in single shot, what we can do now is we can simply perform many single shots after another during a non-rigid movement of the object. And then we end up with a movie of 3D data points. And again, if this is choppy, please look at this link here. Yeah. And what we see here is, this is a zoom in the 3D movie. And I have to emphasize here that in the whole talk, I only show raw data of the sensor here. So there's no post-processing or no interpolation applied. So each point that you see here, yeah, is an individually measured 3D point with very high precision, 200 microns in this case on human skin. Yeah. And since there is no pattern codification and no spatial correlation applied, there's also no low-pass filter on the data, and the edges are very nicely preserved, as you can see here in this kind of accordion experiment. Okay, so I introduced you now the basic principle. Now let's talk a little bit about the physical and the information theoretical limits of this method. And the first limit we're going to discuss is the limitation of the distance precision. And this goes now a little bit into optics and Speckle theory. So if you're not so familiar with that, please bear with me. It will get better on the next slides. So what we know from decades of research in Erlangen, where I did my PhD thesis, is that the dominant noise source for active single-shot triangulation is speckle noise, even if no laser is used. Yeah? And the distance precision in presence of speckle noise is actually given by this formula here. So here we have the wavelengths, the triangulation angle, this is the observation aperture. And an essential role here plays the so-called speckle contrast, which is the inverse signal-to-noise ratio. And to improve the distance precision, you need to perform now a physical optimization of the speckle contrast, where the temporal and especially the spatial coherence of the illumination is very, very important. And we did this in optimization, and eventually we experimentally evaluated the distance precision and got values between 200 micron and only 17 micron in the very best case. And you can actually calculate theoretically that this is very close to the limit of what is actually physically possible for this kind of multi-line triangulation setups. And the second limit I quickly want to discuss is the limit of the line density. So also, without going into detail here, I think you will all believe me if I say that the lines have to be separable in the camera image. And this separability is basically dependent on those three factors: the sampling theorem, the subpixel precise maximum evaluation of the lines, and the object surface inclination. And to save you now from all the math, I can also directly tell you the result. So we calculated the theoretical maximum for parallel lines that can be projected with a 1 megapixel camera, and this maximum is 160 lines. And our sensor also operates at this limit, meaning that we can really reach this number here in our setup. But actually, turns out that with pretty simple engineering trick, we can even nearly double this number again. And this trick is by the projection of a crossed line pattern. And the gag here is that you can do this even without introducing additional cameras to the system. So only by a slight displacement, as you can see, of the cameras that are already in the system. And in fact, what we are doing here is we create 4 triangulation sensors with only 2 cameras. Yeah, and this is then how such a 3D model with a crossed line pattern looks like. And in this zoom in window, you actually see how dense the object is really sampled here. So each point that you see here is an individually measured 3D point. Yeah? And with this, we can acquire nearly 1/3 of a million independent 3D points in each 1 megapixel single shot. Now, yeah, and last but not least, we also evaluated our principle under information theoretical aspects. And I also just briefly mentioned this here. So what we did is we started at the information theoretical model for 3D sensors that we have discussed before. And then we used Shannon's channel capacity to come up with an information theoretical figure of merit that can be used to quantify different 3D imaging principles. And we call that channel efficiency. And I need to direct you to my PhD thesis here for details, because I will not explain in detail what all these terms mean. But the basic construct is output information in form of a 3D image divided by the input information in form of the captured 2D images. And what comes out of this estimation is that our sensor performs around 8 to 10 times better than other single shot principles, like for example, the Apple Face ID. Yeah. And it basically reaches the same performance as the multi-shot principle phase measuring triangulation, which is known to be the gold standard in terms of efficiency. But of course, phase measuring triangulation is not motion robust, yeah, which is the big benefit of our method. Yeah, and before we move on to the next project or to the next topic, just a quick side note. So of course, we can also do this with color cameras as well. So here, this is an image of the prototype where you see the preview of the 3D model on the screen. And this is how such a colored 3D model looks like. Still raw data, no post-processing applied here. And I think many people in the audience actually can imagine what you can do with a 3D sensor that outputs raw data with this kind of quality. Yeah, and this is the last video that I will show, which basically shows the real-time capability again of our sensor. So even if we use fairly slow cameras, which are working only at 30 frames per second, we can still image this jumping ping pong ball without any motion artifacts. And this can become now, very important for the 3D inspection of very fast processes, like for example, crash tests, bullet impacts, exploding airbags, medical motion analysis, and so on. Okay, that's it for the single shot 3D movie camera. And with this, we move on to the next research topic for today, which is also a textbook example for proper illumination encoding. And these are our synthetic wavelengths imaging principles. And here I will mainly talk about synthetic wavelengths holography, which is a novel method to tackle the new and exciting problem of imaging around corners and imaging through scattering media like fog, for example, or skin. So this slide here is a kind of teaser slide that should show you the future potential of the research field of so-called non-line of sight imaging and imaging through scattering media. So if you would have a sensor that could look around corners, you could, for example, detect obscured objects on curvy streets here, or you could build a kind of optical endoscope to detect defects in running machinery. So these are only a few examples, of course, but basically what you want to do here on the left side is you want to turn walls into mirrors. And for imaging through scattering media, on the right side, the promise here is that you could, for example, monitor the beating heart through the breast, or you could look at brain vessels through the skull, all without using X-rays or MRI or something like that, basically just with visible or nearly visible light. And if you start to think now a little bit deeper about both of these scenarios, you basically realize that both sides here share exactly the same problem. And the problem is that light, for both sides, light is basically scattered in all directions and completely loses its spatial structure during the scattering process. And people came up with the idea pretty quickly that instead of spatially structuring the illumination, like in these structured light principles that we saw before, they should look at the time of flight of the light. So basically measure the path lengths that the light travels from the sensor to the wall, to the object, back to the wall, and then back to the detector. But the thing is, we already know that these so-called time of flight cameras, which are used in many state-of-the-art approaches, by the way, cannot always satisfy the resolution requirements of the applications that we want to do. And this is basically because of limitations in silicon manufacturing technology, which restricts the maximal modulation frequency or the minimal modulation wavelengths, which is, as you can see here, directly proportional to the depth error. And the smallest wavelengths that can be achieved with these time of flight cameras, actually on the orders of tens of centimeters, and this results in a depth error of around 1 centimeter. There are alternatives to that. On the other end of the spectrum, there is another time of flight principle, which is actually well known in optical metrology, and this is interferometry. And interferometry is not using a modulated light source at all. Interferometry is using the oscillations of the physical wave light field itself. So it works with very small optical wavelengths, up to several microns, and it's very precise, up to nanometers resolution. But there's always a but, right? Conventional interferometry cannot be used on rough surfaces because of a very fundamental effect called speckle. And we have already heard this word before. So for those who don't know, just a very quick explanation. What is speckle? So speckle is basically the phase randomization that happens if a coherent light wave is scattered or reflected off a rough surface. And if we capture such a speckle pattern with an imager, then the phase of this pattern is actually completely randomized and basically reveals no information about the time of flight of the light anymore. There is a condition to avoid speckle, and this condition is that the maximal wavefront aberration psi here must be smaller than 1/4 of the wavelengths. But I think all of you can already understand that for optical wavelengths, this can be only reached for nearly mirror-like surfaces, basically because these wavelengths are so small. So going back to this slide, ultimately what we need now is we need a wavelength that is larger than optical wavelengths, but smaller than time of flight wavelengths. And fortunately, this huge gap that you see here can be closed by exploiting principles that are known from dual wavelengths interferometry. And this is exactly what we are doing. So this approach that I introduce you now exploits encoding at different optical illumination frequencies. So what does this mean? This means if we superimpose two lasers with slightly different wavelengths, then we produce a high frequency wave with a low frequency beat node. And by special detection methods, we are actually able to electronically isolate this beat wave and to create a low frequency synthetic wave. And this synthetic wave can now be freely chosen, depending on the two optical wavelengths that you choose, as you see here in this formula. And we can use this very established encoding and decoding method now to perform something very new and exciting. And this is holography at the synthetic wavelengths. So what we do here is we shine light at the two wavelengths towards the scatterer. And in this case, the scatterer can be a wall, or it can be tissue, or it can be a cloud. It does not really matter here if the scattering is happening in reflection or in transmission. And then the light is scattered. We have two speckle patterns that illuminate the object. And then the rough object surface creates another speckle pattern that again hits the scatterer. And after the last scattering process, we have these two completely scrambled wavefronts with an aberration psi that is actually much, much larger than one optical wavelength. And the only thing we can measure with our detector now are these two speckle fields at the two wavelengths. As you can see, each speckle field for itself would not contain any information about the hidden object because the phase and the amplitude are completely scrambled. But things change actually if we take the two fields and if we synthesize this correlation term here. And this correlation term contains the difference of the two phase maps. And this term is now particularly interesting because the phase of this term actually does show a clear structure and is not speckled. And what is in fact happening here is that the microscopic phase perturbations at each single wavelength, they cancel each other out. And the phase map at the end contains only information about the macroscopic path length variations, which are on the order of the synthetic wavelengths. So what we end up with here is a hologram of the hidden object at the synthetic wavelengths. And to reconstruct the object now, we simply perform a numerical backpropagation at the synthetic wavelengths. And then we end up with the shape of the hidden object and also with with the position of the hidden object in space. And we did this here for the non-line of sight geometry, where we project the laser on the wall and image then the returned latent field from the hidden object, with a camera. And it's important to note here that both camera and illumination, they cannot directly see the hidden object. And the hidden object here in this case is this small cutout letter N here. And I directly jump to the results, which are captured for different synthetic wavelengths. So the captured phase maps of the synthetic holograms here on the top and the reconstruction of the letter on the bottom. And what is so fascinating to see here actually is that the synthetic wave behaves exactly like an optical wave. What do I mean by that? Is that the resolution gets better with decreasing synthetic wavelengths, but also you see that these measurements at smaller synthetic wavelengths here, they are actually more susceptible to this degradation. Yeah? And this degradation of the result paired with this improvement in resolution that we see actually begs the question, are we approaching a fundamental limit here? Or in other words, how small can the synthetic wavelengths become? Yeah, and we calculated this and we found that the synthetic wavelengths can actually not go below 4 times the maximal wavefront aberrations that are introduced by the scattering processes. Yeah, and this is actually now pretty striking because this is a limit that we already know from classical optics and that we have seen earlier, remember, when I was talking about Speckle. And obviously, this limit is now also true for the synthetic wavelengths. But in this case, the synthetic wavelengths is, of course, much larger than the optical wavelengths and can tolerate much larger wavefront aberrations. And in order to estimate the performance of our system now, we can use, again, the space bandwidth product that we have seen earlier and end up with this term, which is, again, an uncertainty product now between the width of the field of view that you can actually see around the corner and the resolution that you can achieve. And on the right side, you have 2 system constants, the maximal wavefront aberration, which is basically dependent on the surface roughness or the transport mean free path if we have scattering media. And this here, this is the size of the area on the wall that you observe, yeah, the so-called virtual detector. And as I said before, a unique feature of synthetic wavelengths holography is now that we can dynamically adjust our synthetic wavelengths here to different scenarios with stronger and weaker scattering. And by that, we can always approach this theoretical space bandwidth limit always very close. And this can be nicely shown in the next experiment. Here we image through scattering media in a transmissive setup. So the object here now is the small cutout letter U. And you see it's hidden basically behind 2 scatterers. And in the first experiment, we image first through a ground glass diffuser. And later we image through a milky plastic plate. This is basically comparable to one of these cutting boards, yeah, where you cut your onions on. And you can see that this board is approximately 4 millimeters thick here. And you can already see that the information from this checkerboard behind the cutting board is already completely scattered out. Yeah? But nevertheless, we are actually able to nicely detect the object through the scatterer here. As expected, yeah, the milky plastic leads to larger wavefront aberrations. And this means also that these measurements deteriorate faster. But there's also something special about the experiment here with the diffuser. And what is so special here is that we can actually calculate the wavefront aberrations for the diffuser because the diffuser is a known part. It has a known grid size, it has known dimensions, and so on and so forth. Yeah? And our first order calculations actually show us that these wavefront aberrations here that you can calculate for this diffuser are indeed about a quarter of 280 microns. And indeed, you see that this measurement here is shortly before deteriorating, or this reconstruction, I should say. So this means that this measurement is actually very close to the absolute limit of what is physically possible with this kind of method. And I should also say that we know from other resolution experiments that this measurement actually reaches sub-millimeter resolution. Now, yeah, and looking around the corner or through a scatterer with sub-millimeter resolution is something that is very hard to do with current time-of-flight-based approaches. And I think I can show you now more nice results, but I think in the interest of time, I stop here. The only thing that I quickly want to mention is that our recent publication of this project in Nature Communications actually created a large amount of national and international media coverage, also in quite popular news outlets, as you see here, and they are all collected on this webpage in case you are interested. And I guess what I really want to say with this is that this topic is obviously of quite interest for the public. And we hope that this helps us to successfully continue on this path and to explore, all these interesting follow-up problems and follow-up questions to this in the future. Yeah, and with this, I think we can slowly wrap up the talk for today. So to stay in the time frame, I focused today mainly on 2 projects of the research portfolio, which was the single-shot 3D movie camera and synthetic wavelengths holography. And before we actually stop, I actually very quickly want to tease 2 other projects. And if you're interested, you can maybe look them up on our website. And these are our reflectance-based 3D imaging systems. And these systems can be actually implemented in commodity devices like tablets, for example, what you see here. And they even allow for the measurement of specular objects like glass. And I know this might be very interesting for some of the UCLA students here in the audience. And I should also say that in a project which is in collaboration with Facebook Reality Labs, we use a similar principle for precise eye tracking in virtual reality headsets. And as I said, I need to direct you to our website here for further information about this, unfortunately, because the time is a little bit too short. And I think now that's basically it for today. So now the talk comes to an end. But to summarize my talk on a high level, I actually would like to show you a slide that I have adapted from my previous PhD advisor, Gerd Häusler. And this is the canonical model for an optical 3D sensor. So we just learned that such a sensor is always composed of a light source, the surface that we want to measure, and an optical or electronical system like a camera and a computer, which evaluates the encoded information. And we also learned today that the illumination is actually very, very important. And we have here many modalities for the illumination that we can choose from, like coherent, structured, pulsed, you name it basically. Polarized, yeah, polarized, also very important here at UCLA, something that we did not discuss at all today, yeah. And for all these illumination modalities, the object actually looks different and reveals different information. And also the interaction with the surface plays a role. So you have specular reflections, incoherent, volume scattering, and so on and so forth. And finally, we also have to decide which modality we want to observe. Yeah? Is it intensity? Is it frequency? Is it time of flight? And so on and so forth. And now comes the gag. All these possibilities sum up to over 8,000 possible sensor embodiments that everybody of you can actually invent. So what does this actually tell us about computational imaging? Now, first, this tells us that computational imaging is a vast play field that brings you a lot of fun. And I hope that I was able to show you today just a little bit how much fun it is actually, how much fun it is actually to work in computational imaging. But this also means a little bit more. And what this means is that it's also super important, yeah, to understand and even exploit the limits to pick the best sensor for your application and to get the best possible performance for your method. Yeah, and that's it. Unfortunately, I did not get a chance to talk about the other projects that are going on in our lab. Hopefully, I can do this at a future occasion. And what is left to say now is that I hope I was able also to convince you in this talk that limits are not always a bad thing, especially if you know how to exploit them for the optimization of your device and for bargaining with nature. And if you want to know more about our work, please write me an email or have a look at this website here, especially under the research section. And I'm looking forward to your questions now and say thank you for your attention. And I think I stop sharing so that I see all of you.
Sorry, I came late. As I mentioned to you, Florian. Hi, good to see you at a meeting. But great. So let's go into Q&A.
Yeah.
Feel free to just post your questions in the chat or unmute or raise your hand. I think we have a question from Professor Kawasaki.
Hello, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Oh yeah, I'm Hiroshi Kawasaki. Thank you for today's presentation. And actually, very quick question. I'm doing a similar research on the bunch of scan, and I'm wondering now the TOF is very popular now, and how do you think the basic problem is maybe the baseline, and so accuracy is always a problem. And how do you think in the future maybe all the system will be taken over by the TOF, or how about some advantage for the stereo is still remaining, or that's the simple question.
Yeah, so this is a very good question. And indeed, time of flight sensors becoming more and more popular these days. I think in the long term, what you will see is that time of flight sensors will replace structured light sensors for remote measurements that are very far away. Yeah, I think there is still a place for structured light sensors when it comes to these close range applications. Yeah, like all applications that are under a meter away. Yeah, and especially like very small applications, like for example dental measurements or something like that. Yeah. But you are right, especially now, like nowadays, or like what is coming now is FMCW LiDAR, for example. And this, like what they can do is with time of flight principles is very impressive. Yeah. And as you say, time of flight has this big benefit that, the measurement precision does not scale with the standoff distance. Yeah. And this is a big benefit of time of flight principles. Yeah, thank you for this question.
Thank you very much.
Great. I think we have a question from the Bowman Lab.
Hey, Florian. Yeah, really great talk, and you presented it really nicely too. It was very, really great. The work on the end, the scattering work, which I hadn't seen before, super impressive. I was wondering if you, how thin those samples are, and if you've tried to push it thicker, and what are the limits there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This is actually also something that I saved a little bit for the discussion, because I think there's a discussion coming up, right? So what would you wish to know if you are a first year PhD student or something like that, right? Yeah. So, indeed, you are right. So I presented you a limit, yeah? And what this limit basically says is how the synthetic wavelengths scales with the severity of scatter, right? So if the scatter gets more and more severe, like for example, if the sample gets thicker, then what you have to do is you have to make your synthetic wavelengths larger, yeah, in this method that I just presented you. And this can become at a certain point very unfeasible, because then the synthetic wavelengths can become so large that your resolution is actually takes a severe hit, and that you cannot observe the things anymore that you want to observe. So the idea that we have to that is to introduce a second knob, yeah, how you can tune down a little bit the synthetic wavelengths. And what we are currently working on, like our team, is that we introduce time gating to this method. So, so there are approaches, like there are already approaches that use time gating, but these approaches mainly gate out the ballistic photons. So the photons that are not scattered at all, right? Yeah. The nice thing about the synthetic wavelengths method is that you can also use the photons, that you do not rely only on the ballistic photons. So you can also use the photons that are a little bit scattered. Yeah. So you actually have, by introducing this time gating, you have an additional knob that you can turn. Yeah. And of course, the less photons you use, the worse the signal to noise ratio gets, and so on and so forth. So basically what you would have here is you would have another uncertainty relation then that you can, where you can calculate a fundamental limit for.
Oh, cool.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I have to go back and look at the work more carefully, but it's very impressive. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Akshat.
Hi, Florian. Thanks for the great talk and amazing results. I had a question on the single shot 3D project. So I was wondering how the performance is when the object has high frequency texture and albedo variation.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So you saw that the pattern that we project is basically a binary pattern. Yeah, and it's known that binary patterns are actually not so sensitive to albedo variations of the surface. Of course, if you paint the surface with how is that called, vintage black, like this paint which actually does not reflect anything, then you have a problem, right? Because then you don't get a signal back. But in principle, you can say that binary signals are not so sensitive against albedo variations. And for example, this is also the case, like this is the reason why we also do not use color. Yeah. So for example, I can also use this, I can solve this indexing problem by coloring the lines. Yeah. This is the reason why we don't do that. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, thanks.
Great. And Bertie?
Hello.
Hi. Thanks for the great talk. So I guess in the applications you showed, you didn't have any priors on like what you were imaging. And so I was wondering if you've thought about ways to push or even quantify the fundamental limits when you do have a prior.
Yes, that's also very good. I also have to say that. So these fundamental limits that I presented, yeah, like I often get this question, can you push behind this limit? Can you do better than these limits? And the answer is yes. And it's exactly what Bertie just said, if you have prior information. Yeah. And if you have prior information, then you can actually use that and actually go behind this limit. And this is also something that we are currently exploring. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So, I do have a question of my own, but I think we're kind of out of time here. There's a lot of Q&A, so please follow up with Florian by email, those of you who are interested. And Florian, also you have some one-on-one meetings with UCLA and Caltech, so there's a separate sheet for that. So once again, before we break, I'd like to thank our speaker for the Grundfest lecture. Very, very coherent speaker, so really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very fun to be invited, and I'm looking forward now to the meetings.
Yeah, and hopefully one day they'll be in person.
Open slots, right? So please sign up.
Okay, great, awesome. So with that, I'm going to close the